Hi everyone, I'm Dexter, and first want to talk a bit about me. I'm a nerd. I like to do all kinds of technology things. I'm a developer at Passionate People. Thanks for having me here. It's a great company. I really like working there. I'm also a maker. This is an infinity light I was making. It's very simple, but it's cool to make something new, learn a few new things, and yeah, this is my my area. You see my synthesizer on the left. Most of the modules you see there I built myself, and it makes some music, or what I like to call music. I would like to control the things I make and to be able to understand all the parts, to have the knowledge how to fix it, change it, make different things. I like to play around with technology and other stuff. Here you see me and a friend playing with this LED grid I made, creating the code that actually makes the pixels work. I like fresh software. I haven't played with Dino yet, but I find it interesting, and I really should actually play around with it. That's also how I got into Svelte. Some friend told me, you should look at this software, and I did, and I immediately jumped on it. Because I started with Svelte quite early, it also meant like the software breaks once in a while, or you've got a new version coming out, and everything needs to be rewritten, or most bits need to be rewritten. And you also tend to make some mistakes, or you don't know how it works yet, but you're still learning about it. In developing, I quite often like to be in the flow. People talk about the flow. And for me, it makes perfect sense to stay in a flow state when you're not really getting into the details, but you can paint the big strokes and not have to fix some annoying little bug you're smashing your head around for I don't know, a few days, maybe sometimes. It allows me to keep creating new things and to keep playing around with the things instead of getting bogged down into the details. So yeah, I have a lot of side projects, and quite often I notice people being interested in how I do it, what I use, and how I set up my stuff. Like besides the hardware projects, I also have quite a few software projects running, some simple things like a shopping list, synchronizing software, or something to manage people's information for a society I'm a part of. So that's why I'm giving this talk about my sweet stack, my software stack that I use to make my web projects. It's honed over many years of failing and tinkering and learning new software. So my basis is just a simple server, a VPS running on Trends IP, a Dutch cloud provider. And it's just running Debian. I do some things with the cloud, but most things I just like to run on my server with the versions I control. I get to choose who accesses my systems. On top of that, obviously, I use Docker. Docker is great in order to separate all the components apart. And together with Docker Compose, you can control very precisely what versions runs and what access it has to what files and whatever. It's really great. I have played around with many databases, but there's actually one database to rule all databases, in my opinion, and that's Postgres. It's very powerful, it's scalable, it's functional. You quite often don't really need to do big scalable things. You don't run the software in such a scale quite often, so you don't need many complicated multi-tenant, multi-machine databases. And the added benefit is you only need to learn one tool very deeply instead of having many tools to learn all the ins and outs of and not really understanding and controlling them properly. Most of my projects, I have some API to manage the data in Postgres. There's now actually two really cool projects. Hasura, which is a Haskell-based GraphQL implementation who reads Postgres and allows you to manage your access control and the data. I'll show you a bit about that. And the other one is Supabase, which is open source. Really great software. You can run it on the cloud, but you can also self-host it. I haven't really run it on my VPS yet, but I want to get around to that. But that's also a very promising, cool piece of tech. Obviously, my framework of choice is Svelte. Most projects now are SvelteKit, and I really like it. I like how easy it is to get started and to make some components and to get going with it. And for continuous development, to not have to deploy the software constantly by hand, I use GitLab or GitHub CI. I have on the server I have runners installed for both GitLab and GitHub, so I can just quite easily deploy my projects on my VPS. So now I want to take you to my project I've built for this society. And it's storing some personal information, but it's also for people to access the data we store and, for some other things like a media wiki we're running, people can access it. So this is the project. It's on GitHub. It hasn't been seen much love. Like 2 months ago, I did a bit of refactoring. Most of the things you can see are in Docker Compose. I use a piece of software called Nginx proxy, which actually allows you to proxy all the host names basically to the specific containers you want, and you can configure it like this. So this is a virtual host for this domain, and the proxy container actually proxies it and generates a certificate. So there's a simple app. It's a Svelte backend or a SvelteKit project. There's the database, Postgres, and here I map the volumes. The GraphQL is a Hasura, where I configure it like this, and basically it's just three containers running, and that's running the whole thing. So if I show you the live running things, I won't show you the data because there's personal info in there. But I would want to show you the events bit, which is quite nice. I've set up a mail database, and in this mail database, there's just emails being rendered or being generated. For instance, if people's password changed, they want to be notified. If they want to reset their password, they need to receive an email. Hasura has these event triggers, which are based on Postgres listen triggers, I believe. And basically, whenever an entry is inserted into the table, this mail trigger webhook is being called. And if I show you the code, this is the actual code that's being run. So here I set up a node or a SMTP transport. I'm not hosting my own email. That's another part. That's very tricky to do properly. And this is basically a webhook being called. It gets some data because you cannot really trust whoever calls this webhook to do it properly. So you need to verify from the data itself. There's some server token being generated here. And it gets the template from a set of templates. And these templates are plain old Svelte components. This is basically an email template for letting people know that their password has been changed. It renders it with the current render context, and it sends it out. It's quite simple, but in this way you generate emails for people. Another interesting bit is, I'm showing you on the server itself. We have quite a bit of software running, but I don't want to set up an OAuth provider and do all these complicated things. It's quite a lot of software to keep online for all the people. There's actually quite a few images running here. This Nginx proxy allows, or Nginx in general, allows for all web calls to have some subcall, basically. I did have it. So whenever someone goes to, for instance, the wiki, we can do a subcall to see if their token is still valid. And if it isn't, redirect them to the login page to get a fresh token. So if we go to the proxy, I can show the verify member. Basically, this Nginx configuration is being inserted, and this is saying on auth request, that's what it was called, it will call this auth location, and it will pass it to the members app, which is the Svelte app, and that basically is the same call as this one. So it will call the verify webhook, which will just basically verifies the token. It gives an OK. It gives some context back, so Nginx can pass that information back to the other service, and otherwise it generates an error. And that allows us to basically have people log in to whatever things. And so even though software like MediaWiki is not really made to integrate with other, it's made to integrate with other things, but you don't have to have the software always present to connect to an OAuth or an LDAP system and set it up. So this way, I'm being redirected to the members portal and can log in. And then we're logged in. And even Wiki now knows me as Dexter, and logging out also works. For deploying it, I guess most of you are familiar with the GitHub Actions. Really cool and free. So I let GitHub build my software, but the deploy step actually happens on the host itself, on the VPS itself. So basically GitHub SSH to my machine, checks out master. It copies the environment, because the environment is not in GitHub, but it's in a local file. It pulls the dependencies, and it just deploys the services by running Docker Compose up. It's pretty simple. So yeah, that's sort of how I have my software set up. I'm not really a big fan of serverless. You're not really in control of where your software is running. If your file system calls are really file system calls, and what API limit you have, what access control there is. You can learn about it, but quite often it's not really necessary, because you're not Google. There's this really interesting article about it, but basically, the most of the projects we build are not necessary to be in Google scale. It's just simple things for maybe 100 people or maybe 1,000 people, or it's a simple website with less traffic. And if you're being successful, it's always easier to scale than to scale prematurely and to learn about all the nitty-gritty details to how Lambda works, what the rate limits Lambda have. When you hit the rate limits, to have to build your software reliable so it can handle with the rate limits, stuff like this. If you control all the parts or make all the parts very simple, it will be much easier and you can be much more creative. Also, limitations, not having all the skill or the things that feed creativity. So whenever you can limit yourself in a certain way, learning only one thing, you can really dive into it and understand the things better. But never stop playing. If you see something cool like the CSS APIs that's coming out, really do something and break it. It doesn't need to be perfect. Yeah, that was my talk. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Maria Lamardo. I am the head of accessibility training at CVS Health. We're kind of a big pharmacy in the US. I'm also a senior manager for the accessibility engineering team at CVS Health. I am a Vue.js community partner, and I'm a community organizer for my community, just a quick note that my thoughts are my own. And with that, let's talk about accessible, reusable components. Let's see. Here we go. I'm just going to take a quick pause here. If you want to just scan the QR code to open the slides, feel free to do that. That way you can follow along as I talk. I see a couple of you with your phones, so I'll give it a minute. Awesome. OK, cool. I will move on. So today I'm going to be talking about reusable components, and we're going to talk about some of the specifications and what documentation exists out there to help you out and figure out what the best practices exist for certain components. There are some things that HTML simply cannot do or does not support by itself, so we need the help of ARIA to help us expand on that functionality. So let's get into modals a little bit. So looking at the documentation for modals, so let me open that up. So I'm going to show you, this is the why ARIA authoring practices. Now, why ARIA stands for Web Accessibility Initiative, Accessible Rich Internet Applications. Now, that's like a mouthful. Thank you. OK, here we go. So here we see, I'm actually going to jump up. But here it kind of outlines all of the things that you need to know about ARIA, why ARIA might be bad. You never want to use ARIA unless you absolutely have to. And then it talks about some instances that you might want to use ARIA for. So here are a couple of components and widgets that you might need to use it for. So again, I'm going to jump into dialog modals, because that's going to be our first widget for the day. And we can see that it kind of talks about what a modal dialog is, and then it kind of goes into some examples. If we scroll down, it also talks about the keyboard interactions that are expected for this specific widget, and then it kind of has some notes on like, what do you do with focus when you have a modal? So there's a couple of really interesting documentation in here that I definitely recommend you read, but if you're not into reading all of that, I've kind of abstracted some of that information for you today. So let's get into it. Some of the design considerations for modals are that a modal must have a button that closes the modal. So a modal is something that, like, when you, and I'll show you an example. Let me bring it up. Yeah, here's a modal, right? So let me zoom into that. So a modal is, you're in somewhere, you open it up, you can tab inside the modal only, and then you can kind of exit that modal. So again, you want to have a way for you to exit and close that modal out. You also want to make sure that you're obscuring the back of the modal with some styling, so maybe like make it a little bit gray. But not just making it gray, you also want to make sure that you're preventing users from being able to interact with elements that are behind that component, so that behind the modal, you shouldn't be able to touch or access it with your keyboard as well. Some interaction considerations. When the modal opens, you have to think about how you're going to handle that focus. You don't want the focus to stay on the element that opened that modal to begin with. So you can set focus to either the first focusable element inside that modal, or a static element on top of that modal. Let's say like you have a title, maybe it's just like a consent form that you need people to read through, right? Now, if you're setting something focused to an element that is non-interactive, then you want to make sure that your content's still easy to read and that you're not setting focus on an element that's going to scroll some piece of information out of view. So make sure that everything's staying in view, make it easier to read. And you also don't want to set focus to something that is going to be super destructive for the user. Let's say that you have an interaction where you open a modal to delete your account. You don't want the first focus to go to, yes, delete my account, because they might, by mistake, click it, and then that action is irreversible. Most frequently used interaction, you want to make sure that you're limiting information and continue processing. So when you're closing the modal, you also have to focus, create that focus interaction. So when you're closing the modal, you want to set focus onto the element that closed the modal. And if that doesn't make sense, you can set it to a different element. For example, if the modal, the element that triggered opening the modal doesn't exist for any reason, you might want to set it to another element that fits in that workflow. You might also want to do it, if it doesn't make sense that nobody's going to reopen that modal again, you might set it to the next element that works, that makes more sense within that action, especially if it's very unlikely for somebody to open that modal again. Again, from the documentations, here are the keyboard interactions that people expect from modals. You should be able to tab through everything in the modal that is interactive, and you should be able to loop around, so you're not leaving the modal and the focus isn't going behind the modal. Shift-tab should do the same backwards, and you should code it so that the escape key will also close the modal. So here are some of the technical considerations, and here's where we start using some ARIA. You want to make sure that that container has a role of dialog, and we'll go into a code example soon. We also want to make sure that it has an ARIA modal set to true, so this is where we start playing around with ARIA. Then we want to make sure that it has ARIA label and ARIA labeled by to refer to the dialog title. Now this is going to help assistive technologies figure out what the naming of this element will be. And optionally, you can add additional descriptions to the modal by providing ARIA described by to anything on the page. Again, all elements required to operate the dialog should be descendants of that dialog container. So here's kind of what it looks like, right? So here we see that we have a role of dialog in that container that holds this whole thing. We have ARIA modal equals true because we want assistive technologies to understand that, hey, this is indeed a modal, pick it up as a modal. We also are adding ARIA labeled of a title. That way, it tells the assistive technology, hey, this is a modal, and the title is this title of the dialog, which I've set it to my heading. You could use ARIA described by if you wanted to add some of the description from inside the content of that dialog. And again, I'm closing it with a button with an X, and because it's meaningless, I've added an ARIA label to say close. That way, assistive technology can pick that up. So let's go into the example. And with this example, I'm actually going to turn on my screen reader. I am using a Mac, so I actually have VoiceOver already installed.
To enable screen reader support, press
OK, so if you have a Mac, you could turn on your screen reader. This is already built into your systems by clicking Command F5. And don't freak out, you can turn it off just the same. Command F5 will turn it back off. You can read about it. I think the first time you turn it on, they'll kind of walk you through a little tutorial. So it's really cool.
Heading level 1, modal example. Heading level 1, modal example. Heading level 1, modal, open modal, button, open modal,
happening?
button, reload.
All right, glitching a little bit.
Space with Chrome.
But you can see how verbose the screen readers are, right? So be careful with what you do.
Entering code and open modal, button.
OK, so I heard open modal button. I'm going to open it.
Close, and 3 more items. Website web content busy, dialog, close, and 3 more items. Close, confirm. close, confirm, close, confirm.
So you can see that as I'm tabbing through, I'm stuck in there, and I hear the interactive elements, and they all have proper names. I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen reader, and I do want to share with you. I am using Chrome, and I'm going to go ahead and open up my Chrome DevTools, because they have a lot of really cool accessibility information in there. Ooh, sorry, I'm trying to find my mouse in here. OK, here we go. I'm going to open the modal, open up my DevTools. I'm going to go ahead and inspect the dialog that has, the div that has that dialog. And again, I'm in Chrome. There is an accessibility tab where it says styles. Now, this accessibility tab is one of my favorite things about Chrome, and I swear I'll never leave Chrome because of this. But it does give you a little bit of information that assistive technology is going to use to kind of translate everything that you're coding for assistive technologies. So we're really focusing on ARIA attributes or any computer properties that we're seeing in here. So this is going to tell me that, hey, this is the name of this modal. So again, let me just focus on this div. So it tells me this div has a role of dialogue, so assistive technology is going to pick it up as a dialogue. It has this ARIA labeled by, and it has an ARIA modal equals true. And then here's the name of that modal. So again, it's kind of grabbing it from our H2, because that's how we've linked it with ARIA labeled by. So that's kind of how it all connects and works together. So again, make sure that you're kind of creating those relationships. And for reusable components, I do want to show you one of the things that you need to consider. Whoops. Well, I'll do it over here. One of the things that you need to consider is that you do need to add something called a focus guard that will allow you to set focus back into that first element or the last element as you tab through to kind of create that focus trap inside the modal. You don't ever want the focus to go behind and pick up other content by mistake. So this will prevent that from happening. And again, I like to use reusable components. That way I can send it out something like this, right? Instead of having to write all of this over and over and over again, what I like to do is set slots. And then, as you can see here, I'll use templates to send in what I need. One of the things that I want to call out is that because our last interactive element that we want to focus back, like as we're shift tabbing, we want that last interactive element to be our kind of touch point. We do want to make sure that we're calling that out in the template as its own thing. Cool. So let's go into our next one. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about toggle buttons. Let me show you what the authoring tools have to say about this one. So again, there's a lot of information in here. They kind of define a button. They talk about 2 different buttons that exist. They talk about some examples. Again, keyboard interaction expectations. And then some of the ARIA state rules and properties. So let's go into our presentation, because I have a little cheat sheet of all this information. So again, a button is a widget that enables users to trigger some sort of action or event, right? So like opening a modal, submitting a form, anything that you're staying inside that same page, same URL to perform an action. So in here, there are actually 2 types. One is a toggle button, and then there's a menu button. So they kind of go into more specifics. Today, we're going to be focusing on toggle buttons. So a toggle button really has 2 states, and it could be either pressed or not pressed. And to tell assistive technologies about whether a button is pressed or not pressed, we're actually going to be using this thing called ARIA pressed. And that's going to help us create that functionality. I do want to change that we do not want to use ARIA pressed and change the name of the element. So for example, we have like, if you have a password that you want to toggle the visibility of the password, so it says like show password, hide password, we don't want to change the content of that button. We just want to say hide password, pressed, hide password, not pressed, right? So I'll show you what that looks like. Again, we want to focus, we want to consider how we're handling our focus. If activating the button does not dismiss the current content, then the focus should remain inside that button. If the button opens a dialog, then again, follow the dialog patterns that we just discussed about. If a button indicates a change of context, so something changes in the page, you can move the focus to that next action if that makes sense with the flow. Or if it's activated with a keyboard shortcut, then make sure that the focus isn't moved around for the user. All right, and again, here are some of the keyboard interactions that are expected for toggle buttons. Same as regular buttons, we're expected to have enter, trigger this action, and same thing with space. Some technical considerations. The toggle buttons must have a role of button. Again, try to use semantic buttons whenever possible. Make sure that the button has an accessible name. So even just by adding content that is meaningful, that's an accessible name. You can set ARIA describe by to add additional descriptions, add ARIA disabled for any buttons that are disabled, and then ARIA pressed, which is what allows us to communicate that to assistive technologies. So here's kind of what that example looks like. It's pretty simple. You just say ARIA pressed equals false when it's not pressed. So let's get into an example of a toggle button. And actually, I have a couple of examples to show you. So here are two examples. One of them is for toggling the mute and unmute button, right? So as I press it, you could see that, hey, yeah, there's a mute button. It says mute, and then there's a little icon. The icon changes as I press it, right? But if I open up my DevTools, again, I'm in Chrome. I'm going to inspect it. I'm going to open up that accessibility tab that I was showing you earlier. And that is going to show me that inside this button, so that's what I have selected, that has an ARIA pressed of false. As I start toggling it, we see that that pressed changes. And we also see it here in the computer properties of our element. So we see that, hey, we have a role of button. It's focusable element. The user has not had an entry into it, but we see that pressed false true, false true. So for assistive technologies, that's what they're going to pick up. So I'm going to quickly turn on my screen reader to show you this example, and I'll also go into the next one.
VoiceOver, password, mute, toggle button. Selected, mute, toggle button, mute, toggle button, selected, mute.
So this is an interesting thing to show you. So we didn't hear it pick that up.
Show
so
password,
let's try this
toggle
one.
button, selected, show password, toggle, selected, show password.
Perfect. So we didn't hear it say this like selected or unselected, and that brings up a really good point.
VoiceOver
There
off.
are different types of support depending on the assistive technology that you're using and the browser that you're using. So for example, right now I'm using VoiceOver, which works best with Safari. So even though here we're seeing this actually be correct in the code, and we're seeing it in the DevTools that yes, we are toggling those functionalities, we might not hear it inside of Chrome, but we will hear it inside something like Safari. But we could see here that we're seeing ARIA pressed is toggling between true and false. So again, depending on the assistive technology you're using and the browser combination you're using, you're going to have different functionality. Cool. Moving on to accordions. So the documentation kind of outlines this the same way as it outlines all the other components, but some of the design considerations for accordions are that they should be vertically stacked, and there are kind of a set of interactive headings that contain a title, and then that title kind of helps trigger content on appearing and disappearing. Now, that accordion header is that functional piece, and that's what you use to control that functionality. And then the accordion panel is what holds that extra piece of content. So if we're looking at an accordion, which is here, this would be the accordion header, and this would be the accordion panel. So going back here, let's talk about some of the keyboard expectations. So there's really 3 things that users are expecting for this. Everything else is really optional that you could choose to add it to your applications. Number 1, because we are playing around with buttons here, again, enter and space should trigger those actions. Tab and shift tab should move focus up or down. And then optionally, you can add functionality for your arrow keys to work. To move to the next accordion. Same thing with home and end. You can move to the first accordion or the last accordion. Technical considerations. Each accordion header, so the header the button that triggers that action must be wrapped in a heading. It also must have ARIA controls that set it to the content that it actually controls. And then ARIA expanded, which allows assistive technologies to say, hey, this specific accordion has been expanded or it is collapsed. And then, of course, ARIA disabled if you're disabling that button. Optionally, you can give each panel content a role of region and then give it an ARIA label if you want to create these landmarks. Don't create too many landmarks, just as a side note, as this could be very verbose for our users. So that's kind of the last point here. So here's an example. So we have a button. Actually, we have an H3 that wraps around this button. And then this button is kind of what our header is. And then we have ARIA expanded equals true. That's what assistive technologies are going to pick up. And then we're saying this button controls and this ID over here, right? So we're saying it controls this piece of content. So whenever this is expanded, this piece of content is going to be altered. And then the same thing for the panel. This one has a region, and then it has an ARIA labeled by, that we're picking that up as a landmark inside of our content. So we just saw that example that I shared. So again, we can tab through. And there, you can optionally make it so that as you're expanding one accordion, you can collapse all of the rest of the accordions. I do want to show you how I did it over here. So this is how you would make this accordion. It's kind of a lot of code, not too much, but it's pretty verbose. But if you create it in a reusable manner, and again, I've linked to the GitHub here, then you could simply just do something like this, where you're just calling accordions and passing your tabs and the content for each of those tabs, and then that should just generate itself. So it's a lot less verbose, and you have access. If you make it one-time accessible, then it's just going to work forever. So just really consider using these reusable components. Next up, let's talk about tabs. They're pretty common on the web, and I think every time I run into one, there's always some sort of problem. But again, the documentation reads the same as all the other ones. So again, we have a lot of documentation in here. It talks about all of these other different types of components. So no matter what you're doing, this is just kind of walking you through how to read this documentation and abstract this information to create accessible content. So for our tabs, according to the documentation, the sign considerations are that tabs are a set of layers, sections of content known as tab panels that display one content at a time. So it has a tab list. This tab list holds kind of all of the tab elements. Then you have the tab itself. And this is the element that kind of allows you to open or trigger new content to be loaded into that tab panel. And then the tab panel is what holds that content. So it's kind of similar to the accordion in a little bit. And then, of course, you want to make sure it's recommended, if it loads quick enough, that as you tab to a panel, it is automatically triggering that new content. The keyword expectations for this, just like anything else that you're tabbing, is moving focus ahead. You can also add keyword functionalities. If you have horizontal tabs, you want the left and right arrow to move that focus. If you have vertical tabs, then you want the down and up arrow to move those that focus. And then you can also do Shift F10 when focus is on a tab that has an associated pop-up. Again, not very common. And then here are the optional keyboard functionalities that you can add. The home key will take you to the first tab. The end key will take you to the last tab. And you could delete if deletion is allowed. Again, it depends on what type of application you're building. Here are some of the technical considerations. That list of tabs that you're creating must have an ARIA labeled by or ARIA label, so you must give it some sort of name. For each specific tab, you also want to make sure that it has an ARIA control set so that we know what piece of content it is controlling. We also want to make sure that the active tab, so the tab that has the content showing, has an ARIA selected set to true so that assistive technology knows which tab is active in this tab list. And again, if you have a pop-up button, make sure that you're adding the ARIA has pop-up, but again, very rare. And then for each tab panel, so where the content is being held, we also want to make sure that it has an ARIA labeled by that is associated with the tab, so whatever is controlling it. So let's take a look at some of the code. Oh, and then if you're using vertical or horizontal, you should set the ARIA orientation based on this. This you might want to change depending on your screen size as you're changing your media queries, right? If your tab panels ever change to vertical from horizontal, make sure that you're adjusting for it. So this is what the code looks like. So on the left-hand side, we have kind of like the list of tabs. And then on the right-hand side, we have the content. So again, we have this div that holds all of the tabs. that div has a role of tab list to kind of tell assistive technologies there are this many tabs in this tab list, and then each tab is a button that has a role of tab. And then it controls the specific content that complements it. So again, this tab 1 controls tab 1 content, so we see that over here. Now you can see that my content is kind of added into divs. Now divs aren't interactive at all. You cannot tab to a div. But because I've added a tab index of 0, now I can, and my users can now tab into that content and read that content. That is completely optional. All right, let's take a look at a tabs example. So again, here I'm going to just use my keyboard to navigate. I'm going to use my arrow keys. So as you can see, I'm right, and it goes back to my first one. So it can even loop around in that functionality as I tab backwards as well. Again, same thing with my keyboard. And again, same thing, if we're using reusable components, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So again, I've written all of this. So again, we see the role of tab. We're seeing the tab index. That kind of depends on what we're doing. We also want to make sure that the tabs, because they are buttons, they are interactive, and you can tap to them. But we want to make sure that we're not being able to tap to something that is not the current active tab. So we want to pull those out of the tab order. So we can do that by setting tab index of -1, because you can only tab to elements that have tab index of -1 programmatically. So like by a function or a button can trigger, like focus on this element that has a tab index of -1. So once you kind of create this in a reusable way, instead of having to write this over and over and over again, you can do something like this, where you're just saying, hey, here's my tabs and my tab content, and then just embed it into that component. All right, let's go into, oh, here we go. All right, yeah, I have 1 minute left, so with that, I'll say definitely feel free to check out the Why ARIA best practices. They are amazing, amazing resource for checking out how to create accessible components. Definitely check out the WCAG guidelines, which is kind of what accessibility looks for to create accessible applications. And then I have this presentation and the reusable code for this in GitHub. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out, but or talk to me after the conference. Thanks, everyone.